Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going deep on a pretty heavy topic today, global inequality.
Yeah, and we're diving in deep with some pretty dense material, too.
Right. We've got these excerpts from a sociology textbook. It's all about like global stratification, poverty, and a bunch of different theories that sociologists use to try and understand this stuff.
A lot of big words.
Yeah, a lot of big words. But that's why we're here, right? To break it down.
Exactly. We want to make sure you walk away from this deep dive really understanding what global inequality actually means.
Not just the definition, but like the real world impact too.
Right, because this isn't just some abstract academic concept.
Yeah, like remember that horrible Rana Plaza garment factory collapse in Bangladesh?
Yeah, back in 2013.
Over 1,000 people died.
It's crazy when you think about it. That building housed other businesses, too. Yeah.
But most of the people working there were making clothes for like brands we see every day.
Then earning like pennies for our fashion. It's
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the human cost of this whole system.
It really highlights what we call global stratification, right? We talk a lot about inequality within countries, but it exists between countries too, like
A global problem.
huge wealth, resources, power, all that stuff. It's like there's this global ladder, and some countries are stuck way down on the lower rungs.
So how do we even begin to measure something as massive as global inequality? It feels almost impossible to wrap your head around.
It is complex, but sociologists have come up with some tools to try to make sense of it.
Okay, so what are we working with here?
Well, there's one called the Human Development Index. You might have heard of it.
Okay.
It's also known as the HDI.
HDI. Okay.
And it goes beyond just a country's wealth. It looks at things like lifespan and education, too.
So it's kind of like a quality of life score.
Exactly. It's a more holistic view of how a country is doing, not just its bank balance.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it was actually developed by a Pakistani economist named Mahbub ul Haq.
Okay, so good ideas can come from anywhere.
Absolutely. Then there's the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality within a country.
Okay, so how does that work?
So let's say a country has a Gini coefficient of 0.6. That means there's a pretty big gap between the rich and the poor.
So the higher the number?
The more unequal things are.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. But how do we even classify nations these days, without sounding judgmental? Like what happened to terms like developed and developing?
Yeah, those terms definitely felt a bit loaded, right? Like some countries were better than others.
Yeah.
So we've become more sensitive to the language we use. These days, you're more likely to hear terms like high-income, middle-income, and low-income nations.
Right, so it's more descriptive than judgmental.
Exactly. It's about sticking to economic indicators rather than making value judgments.
Okay, but even those labels can be tricky, right?
Absolutely. Like take Indonesia, for example. The World Bank just recently upgraded them to upper middle income.
Wow, upper middle income.
But there are still millions of people there living on less than $5.50 a day.
So it's like these classifications can sometimes miss the nuances of the situation.
They don't always tell the whole story.
Right. And beyond those economic classifications, there's this whole other way of looking at things called the world systems approach.
Right. Have you heard of that one?
I've heard the name, but honestly, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
It was developed by a sociologist named Emanuel Wallerstein. And basically, he divides nations into three categories.
Okay, hit me with them.
You've got core nations, peripheral nations, and semi-peripheral nations.
So how do I picture this in my head? Can you give me like a real-world example?
Think about your smartphone.
Okay.
It was probably designed in a core nation like the United States.
Okay, makes sense.
But the components were likely sourced from semi-peripheral nations like Taiwan.
Okay.
And then it was probably assembled in a peripheral nation like Vietnam.
Wow, so that's the world systems approach in action.
Right there in your pocket.
I never thought about it that way. That's a great example. Okay, let's shift gears for a bit.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how we even define poverty. It seems like such a multi-layered issue.
It's not just about a lack of money, right? It's about a lack of opportunity, resources, and even like a sense of control over your own life.
Yeah. So how do sociologists even attempt to define something so complex?
Well, they've come up with a few different ways to think about it. There's relative poverty, which basically means being unable to meet the average standard of living in your society.
So you might be doing okay financially, but still feel poor compared to everyone else around you.
Exactly. And that feeling of relative deprivation can be really powerful. It can drive people into debt, trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak.
And that just fuels global inequality even more.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. Then there's extreme poverty, which is living on less than $1.90 a day.
Right, that's the kind of poverty we often see in the news.
The most visible and devastating form.
But it's not just about lacking basic necessities, right?
Yeah.
It's about the psychological effects of poverty, too.
Absolutely. Like there's this concept called relative deprivation.
You mentioned that before.
Right. It's the distress that people feel when they're constantly comparing themselves to those who are better off.
So, like, if you're living in a slum surrounded by high-rises and billboards for luxury cars.
Exactly. It can create this feeling of hopelessness and despair, like you're stuck and there's no way out.
It's a reminder that poverty isn't just a material condition. It's a social and psychological one as well.
And our textbook also talks about this really interesting concept called the underground economy.
The underground economy. What's that all about?
It's that whole shadowy world of informal markets and unreported income.
Oh, right.
Like street vendors and day laborers and all that.
Okay, so it's a way for people to make ends meet when they can't find formal employment?
Exactly. It can be a lifeline for people living in poverty.
But it also comes with risks, right?
Of course, because it's all under the table. There's no legal protection, no benefits, no safety net.
It reminds me of another really important aspect of global poverty, the feminization of poverty. Why is it that women are so disproportionately affected by poverty worldwide?
It's a complex issue, but a sociologist named Diana Pierce was one of the first to really shed light on this.
So what are some of the key factors driving this gender disparity?
Pierce identified three main causes. First, the rise in female-headed households.
Okay, meaning?
Often due to things like divorce, separation, or widowhood,
Right.
leaving women as the sole providers for their families. Then there's the persistent inequalities within households where women often have less control over resources and decision-making.
And that makes it harder for them to improve their economic situation.
Right. And finally, there's the impact of neoliberal economic policies, which tend to prioritize free markets and deregulation.
Which sounds good in theory.
Right. But it can erode social safety nets that are really crucial for women.
Like affordable childcare and healthcare.
Exactly. So it's like a triple whammy of social, economic, and political forces working against women.
It's a global problem, but are there certain regions where this is playing out most acutely?
Well, unfortunately, it's a global phenomenon, but
Yes.
some regions definitely face greater challenges, like in Africa, for example.
Okay, what's the situation there?
Well, they struggle with things like limited land availability, inadequate infrastructure, and political instability.
All of which exacerbate poverty.
And push women further to the margins.
And what about Asia? They have the largest concentration of the world's poorest people, right?
That's right. The sheer size of the population in countries like India and China puts immense pressure on resources.
So where do we see the most extreme poverty in Asia?
It's really concentrated in South Asia, with millions of people living in urban slums, facing harsh working conditions in factories, often producing goods for those core nations we talked about earlier.
Right. It's all connected.
And then there's the Middle East and North Africa, where you often see poverty and social unrest going hand in hand.
Yeah, that region has been through a lot in recent years.
Some countries are oil-rich, but others struggle with high unemployment and income inequality.
Which creates fertile ground for instability.
Exactly, like we saw with the Arab Spring uprising.
Right. It's a reminder that poverty isn't just a statistic. It's a lived reality for millions of people.
And it's intricately linked to those global power dynamics we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that really struck me in the textbook was this concept of the sedimentation of inequality.
Right. It's the idea that poverty becomes entrenched, almost like sediment building up on a riverbed.
And that makes it incredibly difficult to escape.
Because the consequences of poverty, like lack of education and limited opportunities, actually become the very factors that perpetuate it.
So it's a vicious cycle, almost impossible to break free from.
It's the heartbreaking truth. Poverty becomes a trap, not just a circumstance.
Okay, so we've talked about the human impact. But now I want to get into some of the theories that try to explain how we got here in the first place. Like, what are the big picture forces at play?
Well, there are two main theories that we should talk about, modernization theory and dependency theory.
Okay, so two very different perspectives on how this global gap came to be.
Exactly. Let's start with modernization theory.
Okay, what's the gist?
Basically, modernization theory argues that low-income countries can improve their economic standing by industrializing and adopting more modern values and attitudes towards work.
So it's like saying, if you want to be successful, just do what we did.
Right, but the critique is that it's very ethnocentric.
Meaning?
It assumes that everyone wants the same things and has the same opportunities, which isn't always the case.
Right. It's like a one-size-fits-all solution, which doesn't really account for the diversity of cultures and contexts around the world.
Exactly. And that's where dependency theory comes in.
Okay, so how is dependency theory different?
Well, it flips the script. It argues that global inequality isn't about a lack of development in low-income countries, but rather about exploitation by high-income nations.
So instead of blaming the victim, it's saying, hey, there's a system in place that's rigged against you from the start.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Dependency theory argues that the global economic system was designed to extract resources and labor from poorer nations, enriching the wealthy nations while keeping others dependent.
It's a pretty radical critique of the world order, but it makes you think, what about countries like China, though? Their economic growth has been incredible. It seems to defy this whole idea of dependency.
It's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of the debate. Some would argue that China's rise actually benefits core nations
How so?
because they need someone to provide cheap labor and resources. But dependency theorists would say that even this growth happens within a system that ultimately benefits the core nations.
So it's like saying you can climb the ladder, but the ladder itself is designed to keep certain countries on top.
Exactly. It's a complex and evolving theory, and China's emergence definitely adds a new dimension to the discussion. Now, while these theories give us that big picture view, I also want to zoom in on the human side of things.
Okay, let's do it. I always love when we get into the personal stories.
The textbook mentions this fascinating book called Factory Girls. It offers a more intimate perspective on this whole global system.
Factory Girls, what's that one about?
It follows the lives of two young women working in a handbag factory in Dongguan, China.
Dongguan.
They're part of this massive wave of migration from rural to urban areas in China seeking better opportunities.
It's a story that echoes the experiences of millions around the world who are drawn into the globalized workforce.
Exactly. And Factory Girls gives us this window into their everyday lives, their dreams, their struggles, and how they navigate this rapidly changing world.
So it's like a microcosm of global inequality.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that these global forces we're talking about have very real consequences for individual lives, even in a place that seems far away like Dongguan.
And it reminds us that global inequality isn't just an economic issue, it's a human one.
Absolutely. These women are working long hours for low wages, sending money back home to their families, trying to build a better future for themselves. It's tough.
Yeah, and it's a great example of symbolic interactionism, right? Like seeing this whole global system through their eyes.
Exactly. It's about understanding their lived experiences, not just looking at the numbers.
Speaking of tough situations, our textbook also talks about modern-day slavery.
Ugh. Yeah, it's a chilling thought.
It is, but it's a reality for millions around the world.
It's like the dark side of globalization, the stuff we don't want to think about. And it's not just the historical image of slavery, like one person owning another.
Right.
Today's slavery takes many different forms, like debt bondage.
Debt bondage.
Yeah, imagine being trapped in forced labor, working to pay off a debt that never seems to go away. Your life controlled by someone else.
Wow, it's almost like indentured servitude, but even worse.
It's a horrible situation.
Yeah.
And then you have human trafficking, where people are lured with false promises of a better life, only to find themselves trapped in exploitative situations.
Often involving sexual exploitation or forced labor.
Right, and then there's child slavery. Children robbed of their childhoods, forced to work in dangerous conditions. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. It's hard to believe this is still happening in the 21st century.
Right.
What can we even do about it? Like, as individuals?
Well, awareness is key. There are organizations out there like Anti-Slavery International. They're doing amazing work exposing these practices, pushing for stricter laws, supporting survivors.
So we can support those organizations.
Yes, absolutely. And we can stay informed about where our products come from. Make conscious choices as consumers. Even small actions can help disrupt this system of exploitation.
So it's about voting with our wallets, being informed consumers, and supporting organizations that are fighting for justice.
Exactly. Now, let's circle back to the consequences of poverty. We know it leads to lack of education, poor health, limited opportunities. But what about the less obvious effects? The psychological toll.
Right, because it's not just about material deprivation.
Poverty creates this constant state of stress and anxiety. You're always worried about making ends meet, putting food on the table, keeping a roof over your head.
It's exhausting.
It can erode your sense of hope. And then you have that idea of relative deprivation that we talked about earlier, where you're constantly comparing yourself to those who have more.
Right, like if you live in a slum surrounded by images of wealth and abundance on billboards and TV.
Exactly. It can lead to feelings of shame, inadequacy, resentment. And that can have a ripple effect on families and communities.
It's a reminder that poverty affects not just our material well-being, but our mental and emotional health as well.
Absolutely. It can impact our sense of self-worth and our ability to imagine a better future.
So we've talked about how poverty creates this vicious cycle.
Mm.
Are there any specific examples of how it limits people's choices in life?
Well, let's go back to factory girls for a minute. Those young women, they face a limited set of options. They can stay in their rural villages, often facing poverty and the lack of opportunity. Or they can migrate to the cities to work in factories, which offers some economic hope, but exposes them to harsh working conditions and social isolation.
So they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
No real good choices.
And those limitations often get passed down through generations, making it even harder to break the cycle. Children growing up in poverty often lack access to quality education and healthcare, which further limits their opportunities. It's this heartbreaking cycle.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the problems, but let's shift gears and talk solutions. What are some things that can be done to address global inequality, both on a systemic level and as individuals?
Well, it's a complex issue, so there's no easy fix. But one key area is promoting fair trade practices.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It means ensuring that producers in developing countries receive fair prices for their goods, and that workers have safe and decent working conditions.
So instead of just focusing on getting the cheapest possible price, it's about thinking about the people behind the products.
Exactly. It's about shifting away from a purely profit-driven model to one that prioritizes social and environmental responsibility.
Okay, that makes sense. What about investing in education and healthcare in developing countries? Those seem like pretty fundamental building blocks for a better future.
Absolutely. Education empowers people with knowledge and skills, opening up new opportunities. And healthcare is essential for a productive and fulfilling life. When people are healthy, they can work, contribute to their communities, break free from the cycle of poverty.
Right. But it's not just about economic development, right? We also need to address the underlying social and political factors that contribute to inequality.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
We need to tackle gender inequality head-on. Empowering women through education, access to healthcare, and economic opportunities is crucial, not just for their own well-being, but for the prosperity of entire societies.
It's about recognizing that women aren't just victims of poverty, but agents of change. Their contributions are essential.
And we need to address discrimination based on race, cast all those factors that marginalize certain groups, and deny them equal opportunities.
Dismantle those systems of oppression. Create a level playing field where everyone has a fair chance.
And we can't forget about good governance, corruption, lack of transparency, weak institutions. All of that just exacerbates inequality and hinders development.
Right, we need strong institutions, accountable leadership policies that prioritize the well-being of all citizens.
Exactly. It's about making sure resources are used effectively and that the benefits of economic growth are shared equitably. Now, while all of these systemic changes are crucial, we also have a role to play as individuals.
Okay, so it's not just about waiting for governments or international organizations to fix things.
Right, our choices matter.
So we have agency too.
We can support charities and NGOs that are working on the front lines of global inequality. There are so many organizations doing incredible work to alleviate poverty, promote education, empower women fight injustice.
So find a cause you connect with and get involved.
Even a small donation or volunteering a few hours a month can make a real difference.
And then use your voice.
Yes. Talk to your friends, family, colleagues about these issues. Share what you've learned from this deep dive, challenge assumptions. Advocate for policy changes. Raise awareness.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected. Our actions, no matter how small, can contribute to a ripple effect of positive change.
Now, we've talked about fair trade practices, empowering women, tackling discrimination, but I want to bring it back to something that hits closer to home. That Rana Plaza factory collapse. It really highlighted how our choices as consumers have consequences on a global scale.
Right, it's easy to forget that sometimes.
Yeah.
Like we're just one person buying a shirt, but it all adds up.
We often think of ourselves as just passive consumers, but the reality is that our choices have enormous power. Every time we buy something, we're supporting a particular company and its practices.
So how can we be more conscious consumers? How do we make sure that our purchases aren't contributing to exploitation and inequality?
It starts with asking questions. Where were your clothes made? Who made them? What were their working conditions? We need to do our research, support brands that are committed to ethical and sustainable practices, and hold those that aren't accountable.
So voting with our wallets, supporting companies that align with our values.
Exactly. And think about the power of boycotts. When consumers collectively refuse to support companies that engage in unethical practices, it can force them to change.
So it's about leveraging our consumer power to create a more just and equitable marketplace. But it's not just about what we buy, right? It's also about how much we consume.
That's a really important point. Do we really need all that stuff? Can we repair things instead of throwing them away? Can we reduce our overall consumption?
It's about shifting away from this culture of disposable consumerism and embracing a more mindful and sustainable approach to how we live our lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our choices have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for people and the planet as a whole.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the causes and consequences of global inequality, examined different theoretical perspectives, discussed potential solutions. But sometimes it feels like the problem is so massive, so overwhelming, that it's hard to know where to even begin.
I understand that feeling. It's easy to feel paralyzed by the sheer scale of the challenge. But remember, change happens one step at a time. It starts with each of us.
So what are some practical things we can do in our everyday lives to make a difference? Where do we go from here?
Well, think about your daily choices. Do you really need that new gadget, or could you wait and save up for something produced by a company with ethical labor practices? Could you buy fair trade coffee or chocolate?
It really does make you think, huh? Like it's so easy to just grab whatever's cheapest. But maybe we should all be taking a minute to think about the bigger picture. Where our stuff comes from. Who made it?
It's about being mindful consumers. And what about those organizations we were talking about earlier? The ones working to fight global inequality. They need our support.
Oh yeah, for sure. We can volunteer our time, donate money, or even just, spread the word about their work.
Exactly. Find a cause that you connect with and get involved. Even small contributions can make a difference.
And we can talk about it too, right? Like with our friends and family.
Yeah, absolutely. Have those conversations. Share what you've learned from this deep dive. You never know who you might inspire.
Just bringing it up can raise awareness and get people thinking.
And remember, change takes time.
Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight.
It's a long game. It takes dedication and a belief that a better world is possible.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into global inequality, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
Global inequality is a complex issue with no easy answers. But it's not hopeless. By understanding the root causes, engaging with different perspectives, and taking action, we can create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless. We have a choice. We can be part of the problem, or we can be part of the solution.
Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to a ripple effect of positive change.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into global inequality. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
And we hope it inspires you to learn more, to engage with these issues, and to be a force for positive change in the world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time.